Okay, hello everyone, and thank you so much for joining us for this month's Black History Series presentation titled From Exclusion to Empowerment, Tracing the History, Legacy, and Lasting Effects of Segregated Schools on Black Canadians with Marium Tolson-Murtty. Marium Tolson-Murtty is a three-time alumna of the University of Windsor, where she completed an honors Bachelor of Arts degree in Communication Studies, a Bachelor of Education, and a Master of Education degree. Marium is currently a PhD student in education, where her research continues to focus on addressing and dismantling anti-Black racism in education and systems of oppression imposed upon Black students in their pursuit and completion of post-secondary education. She is also a post-secondary educator with over 20 years of experience helping students, families, and program development. In 2021, Marium was promoted to Director of Anti-Racism Organizational Change in the newly formed Office of the Vice President, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. She currently serves as the president of the Our Day Study Club and as a board member with the Black Council of Windsor, Essex, where she also served as the chair of the strategic planning. She is also a member of DWIS, Distinguished Women of International Service, and serves on the United Way Windsor, Essex Board of Directors, in addition to serving on their Equity, Diversity, Inclusion, and Belonging Committee. A member of the Women United and the Board of Director Chairperson for Opportunities United. She is also the founder of the post-secondary education mentoring program called Propel, Preparing for the Realities of Post-Secondary Education and Life. Chartered member and mentor of Black Boys Code Windsor, and a past board member of the Youth Connection Association, and serves on several additional committees at the University of Windsor and within the community. In 2022, Marium was recognized by Women's Enterprise Skills Training West during the International Women's Day 2022 with the Influencer Award, and was also recognized as one of Canada's top 100 Black women to watch in 2022 by the Canadian International Black Women of Excellence. This is in addition to being a 2022 nominee for the Windsor-Essex County Chamber of Commerce Business Professional of the Year. And just before we begin, I just again ask that everyone could please turn off your mic while Marium is presenting, just so that it doesn't distract her. And then following the presentation, there'll also be a Q&A. So just type your questions in the comment section, or you can raise your hand and I'll call on you. And at this point, you can turn on your microphone. Also, Marium will be providing her email at the end of the presentation, and she encourages you to reach out to her if you have any further information about what she shared today. And on one final note, if you'd like to support programming such as our Black History Series, you can donate by going to our website, amherstburgfreedom.org. So I'm just going to go ahead and let all these other people in who came in while I was reading your intro. And again, I'm just going to let everyone know who just is entering that this presentation is going to be recorded. So if you don't want to appear on the camera, please turn your camera off. So I'll pass it over to Marium. I'm so grateful again for you to presenting today. I know how busy you are, so thank you again for doing this, and I'm really looking forward to it.
Thank you, Lorraine. I'm just confirming that you can hear me.
Yep, I can hear you, and I can see your slide as well with your title and presented by Marium Tolson-Murtty. So we're good to go.
All right, thank you, thank you. Unfortunately, I cannot see anybody names or anything. All I can see are my slides, but I thank all of you for being here this morning, and I want to thank the museum, just because we did have to postpone it from last week. I've been under the weather for the last couple of weeks, and you might still be able to hear it in my voice, but I didn't want to postpone this any further, as I am actually looking forward to presenting this information as well. So with that being said, thank you all for being here today. It's an honor and a privilege to engage in this presentation, this discussion, this conversation with all of you. But before I do begin, I would like to start by acknowledging the land on which we gather. So as people of African descent, we offer this land recognition in solidarity with the Indigenous peoples of Turtle Island in the efforts and deliberate intentions towards decolonization. As people of African descent, we acknowledge the land of Turtle Island that sustains us, express deep gratitude to its Indigenous peoples, and pledge to honor our dignity and divinity that ultimately connects us all. And I would like to thank my friend and colleague from the University of Windsor, Kay Johnson, for this particular land acknowledgement. So, good morning once again. I think I just went a little bit too far, but I'm just gonna actually, if someone can confirm, Lorraine, do you see
I
the
see
slide that said,
overview.
okay, perfect. I just want
Yeah,
to make sure I'm going in the right order here.
no problem. Feel free
Uh,
to ask again if you're not sure. No problem.
Okay, thank you. So good morning once again, everyone. I would like to thank Lorraine, Mary Catherine, and everyone from the Amherstburg Freedom Museum for providing me with the opportunity to present on this topic today. I thank all of you for joining us in this virtual space, in this conversation about a topic that is extremely important to me as an educator. But first, for those of you who may not know me, I would like to mention just a few things about myself. I do thank Lorraine for providing that introduction, but I just wanted to provide this slide just to kind of give you a general overview. I mean, Lorraine did cover a lot, so I won't bother going over everything, but this is just a snapshot of who I am. I presented this information in one of my doctoral courses, just as we were getting to know everyone in our cohort, and I thought this sort of summed it up a bit. You know, there is a picture of myself, my husband, my two kids who are now teenagers, and one is just driving right now, which is unbelievable. But this is just a snapshot of who I am, my family, who I represent as a dual citizen, Canadian and American, honoring both my mother and father as a proud Underground Railroad descendant, and just everything I am in terms of being an educator, because I believe I use that educator lens in terms of all the work that I do. Everything that I approach is through an educator lens, and basically who I am, and my background. So I thank Lorraine for that introduction, and this is just to provide additional information about who I am as well. So as an educator, although I've helped serve the needs of students in various roles that I've held for over 2 decades, I've been particularly interested in the needs and concerns and success of Black students as I've witnessed the treatment of Black students in the K to 12 system over the years, and even within the post-secondary education system as well. So, from exclusion to empowerment is about how Canada's history of segregated schools, which was designed to oppress, marginalize, and treat Black people as inferior human beings, has led not only to a lasting legacy of racial trauma as a result of a colonialist education system, but has also fueled the desire to learn, self determination, and resistance to no longer be known as the other. Today, I want to speak to you about the lasting impact of segregated education in Canada. Now, for some, this history is not new. Some may have experienced segregated schooling firsthand as a student, as a teacher, or both. However, with today's discussion, I want to bring a unique perspective to the conversation and not only speak to the existence of segregated education, but to the lasting impact of segregated schooling in this country and how the impact reveals itself in the education system today, more so in the form of racial trauma. I started exploring the psychological impact of racism many years ago as a post secondary educator. Much of it was simply observation, and the data I was collecting was anecdotal. However, I had the opportunity to delve further into the issue once I started my doctoral studies. I was presented with the opportunity to submit a book chapter proposal which focused on the issue of mental health and education that would be used in teacher education programs. Right then and there, I knew I wanted to present on the impact of systemic racism, as this was imperative to provide teacher candidates with the historical context necessary to become the socially conscious, trauma informed, and racial trauma informed teachers they claim to want to be. Therefore, the book Understanding Mental Health Across Educational Contexts, Promoting Wellness in Classrooms, edited by Dr. Lindsay Jaber from the University of Windsor. This is the book that has finally been released. This is almost 2 years in the making. And my book chapter, which is chapter number 3, is From Interest Convergence to Dismantling Anti-Black Racism in Education, the Edification of a Teaching Praxis. So this chapter examines the core elements and pathology of racism in the Canadian K-12 education system and its impact on students. Additionally, examining the persistence of racist ideologies and the roles teachers can play in their fundamental pedagogical practices can lead to monumental cultural shifts which will impact student experiences. So the impact of anti-Black racism on students, in some respects, a lost generation of Black graduates that did not drop out of school, but were essentially pushed out. So today's discussion, from exclusion to empowerment, will focus on the following points: the historical context, school segregation in Canada, the overt and covert exclusionary practices in education, the impact of racial trauma on students, and the legacy and the pathology of the history of the segregated school practices, which have led to the experiences that are still felt today. So anti-Black racism in education has been documented across Canada. You know, the concerns and the impact of racism on students in Canadian schools through the decades, you know, they've been well documented. You know, the commissioned reports from some of Canada's largest school boards have revealed a disturbing legacy of racial trauma and trauma inflicted upon school-aged children. From the Ontario Safe Schools Act, School Discipline and Discrimination 2001, the Review of the Peel District School Board Report 2020, the Ontario Human Rights Commission Open Letter to Universities and Colleges on Racism and Other Human Rights Concerns 2020, Canada's Anti-Racism Strategy 2019 to 2022, the Province of Manitoba 2017, the Province of British Columbia 2023, and the Province of Nova Scotia 2022 are just a fraction of the calls to action in the form of recommendation, commission reports, and public outcry for racial justice and equity in education, equality rather. Racism within Canadian schools has been a mainstay for nearly 2 centuries. The foundation of Canadian K-12 education rests on a colonial framework, which includes the unspeakable legacy of residential and segregated schooling, causing irreparable harm to survivors and an indelible stain on Canada's education system. As a result, microaggressions, academic streaming below student skill level, higher levels of student disciplinary measures, student dropout and pushout, and toxic environments for racialized students. The heinous nature of these acts casts students to the margins, disengaged, disregarded, and disenfranchised. Now, in this section, I want to talk about interest convergence. And anyone who knows me or that's been around me as I've started to explore my research and talked a little bit about critical race theory, they know that I've spoken quite a bit about interest convergence. And I like to educate people on interest convergence as much as I can. And in this particular instance, it really speaks to how our school system has evolved and why. So, in terms of critical race theory operates on the foundation of 5 tenets that are pivotal to utilizing a critical race theory lens in addressing systemic inequities. One of the tenets, interest convergence, is one of the great tenets of CRT, which profoundly impacts the sustainability of anti-racism practices in schools. Derek Bell, the architect of this tenet, argued, for example, that the Brown versus Board of Education from 1954 decision, in which the United States Supreme Court outlawed de jure segregation of public schools, was not the result of moral breakthrough of the High Court, but rather a decision that was necessary. For instance, this ruling was necessary, one, to advance American Cold War objectives in which the United States was competing with the Soviet Union for loyalties in the Third World. Two, to quell the threat of domestic disruption that was a legitimate concern with Black veterans who now saw continued discrimination as a direct affront to their service during World War II. And three, to facilitate desegregation in the South, which was now viewed as a barrier to the economic development of the region. In other words, the interest of Black civil rights coincided for a brief time with the interest of the dominant white majority. Okay? So, in terms of the roots of systemic racism in education, we talk about post-colonialism, and I say that with a question mark. You know, one of the foremost contemporary scholars of post-colonialism, Robert Young, describes post-colonial work as examining the effects of colonialism on contemporary cultures globally, in addition to revealing colonial mechanisms that are still employed to ensure economic, political, and cultural dominance of the colonizer over the colonized. From this point of view, like colonialism, post-colonialism functions internally as well as externally as a culturally hegemonic force that requires the participation of the colonizer who imposes the conditions and the colonized to submit to those stratifying conditions whose societies are thus economically, materially, and culturally subordinated. As well, a particular significant characteristic of the post-colonial mechanism of control is the process of othering. Spivak, a renowned researcher, one of the foremost scholars on marginalization and socially oppressed and repressed communities, defines the colonizing power of othering as the practice of representing and defining the colonized natives as inferior to their European counterparts. Now, there is something that I want to mention in terms of the Brown versus Board of Education decision. One thing I wanted to mention that in terms of that decision and the three components that I mentioned, it is important to remember that this decision was essentially based on interest convergence, which is ultimately about alignment and not altruism. So, keeping in mind these decisions weren't based out of the goodness of anyone's heart. It was because it was the proper thing that was needed in terms of world relations at the time. Oops, sorry, I just hit something there. And please, as Lorraine mentioned earlier, if anyone has any comments about any of the information that is being shared or wants to add to it, please feel free to add any of those comments to the chat as well. I definitely recommend that. And also, I do want to say that my perspective here today does not necessarily come from the perspective as a historian. You know, I'm a researcher that focuses on phenomenology, interpretism, critical race theory, uh, womenism, and Black feminist thought. So that is also the perspective that I wanted to share with you today in terms of how I come by this research and the lens in which I sort of view this research and how I present it as well. So I thought that was definitely important to mention here today. So, in Canada, the history and lived experiences of Black Canadians are not defined by the era of enslavement, immigration, and migration. Now, for the purposes of this presentation, a synopsis of the pathology of racist ideologies within the Canadian K-12 systems will be provided. So, in this slide, which if anyone has had an opportunity to see the Anti-Black Racism Task Force report from the University of Windsor that was put out in 2021, and there may be some people on this call that were members of that task force, what I thought was important to add to that report was a timeline of racism in segregated schools in Canada. Now, I understand that you may not maybe be able to see everything that is posted on your screen, but I will be going through some of these dates and some of these postings that are here. So this is a timeline just in terms of the segregation in schooling, the regions, and just the evolution since 1807 up to 1983 when the last segregated school in Canada closed. So if you're not able to see all of the sort of postmarks here, don't worry, I will come to those in just a moment. But this is just sort of a visual, just in terms of where we've been and essentially where we're going. And I would like to, at some point, even do an update on this. So we had the last segregated school closing in 1983, but I think it's important to put those timelines in there as well in terms of these commissioned reports and what public schools are doing, public, Catholic, French, what have you, and all provinces are doing to address the racism. And I say racism because all of this is essentially the evolution of what has been experienced in segregated schools back from 1805, 1807 up until the 1980s. So it may not be legal to have segregated schools, but it doesn't mean that that system of oppression still does not exist within our education system. So as an educator, it is imperative to acknowledge the generational trauma caused as a result of enforced residential schooling in Canada. Efforts towards truth and reconciliation are crucial in honoring and respecting Indigenous peoples and our place on Turtle Island. I will respectfully leave further discussions on the indigenization and decolonization of the Canadian curriculum to my Indigenous colleagues and elders to lead us in these efforts in meaningful and impactful ways. So public schools were established in Canada in 1841. Chief Superintendent of Upper Canada, Egerton Ryerson, assumed the role in 1844, a position he held for 32 years. He was extremely influential in the structuring of the school systems across Canada. This school structuring would include racially segregated and residential schools built on colonialist Eurocentric framework, which Ryerson adopted for Canada. The enslavement of Black people in Canada spans the period from 1629 to 1834 and was abolished in most British colonies in 1834. However, legal racial segregation continued as part of societal norms through the perpetuation of racist ideologies about racial inferiority. Racial segregation is the separation, and I just provide this definition for those who may not really be familiar with what segregation is, but racial segregation is the separation of people or groups of people based on race in everyday life and is denied equal access to opportunities in such areas as employment, housing, transportation, immigration, healthcare, commercial establishments, and education. Black people were not permitted to learn how to read or write, and it was illegal for anyone to teach Black people how to do so. The process of seeking an equal education equivalent to that received by white citizens would prove impossible for several generations of Black people in Canada. In 1850, the Common Schools Act, also known as public schools, the legislation governing education in Ontario and Nova Scotia, was amended to include a separate schools clause. This clause established separate schools for Catholics, Protestants, and Black people. White families enforced informal segregation in other provinces, including Alberta, Saskatchewan, New Brunswick, and Prince Edward Island. In some places, there were separate school buildings designated as Negro schools. In regions where students attended school at the same one-room schoolhouse, if attending at the same time, they were relegated to different benches based on their race. Schools for Black students were severely underfunded, conditions were deplorable, education was inferior, and some schools only met as little as 3 months of the year. When combined with residential isolation and economic deprivation, poor schooling helped to maintain a situation of limited opportunities and restricted mobility for Black people. So at this time, the next two slides, these are some of the names of some of the segregated schools that I found in Ontario. And if some of you happen to know these schools or know someone that attended those schools, or maybe even know where the schools were formerly situated, because I'm sure they're not there anymore, please, let us know. So as you can see, we have King Street School in Chatham, Ontario. We have, sorry, I can barely read my, my own slides here, but we have the Sharon School in Amherstburg as well. SS number 11, which many of us are familiar as well, which is in the Buxton region. I know that building still stands. I believe it has been converted into a residence at this time. We have the Dawn School and the Lucan School as well. So these are some of the schools in Ontario, in our region, that were designated Black segregated schools. So definitely, if you have any information about any of those schools, like I said, if you know someone, your mother, father, grandmother, great grandmother attended these schools, please put that information in the chat, or if there's anything that you want to share, please do. I welcome all of you to do so. And then, I have this wonderful list that I found in Nova Scotia as well. And, many of us know of, the conditions in Nova Scotia and the segregated school system there, and, Africville as well. So many of the schools that I've been able to find, and my mission is to find pictures of these schools as well. I will have to do a little bit more digging, but in terms of the limited scope I had at this particular time, I was not actually able to come across the pictures of the structures from back in that day. But this is definitely for your information in terms of, okay, so these are, some of the additional schools in our country that were segregated as well. So as many of you may know as well, the last segregated school in Ontario, school section number 11 in Colchester, did close in 1965. Now, I always say around 1964, 65, depending on the resource that we're looking at. So I'm led to believe that it was probably the 64, 65 school year. And with that being said, we are upon the 60th anniversary of that, which is, pretty astounding to me that it's been 60 years since that school closure. And the original provisions of racial segregation in education remained law in Nova Scotia until 1950. And the last racially segregated school in Canada, located in Guysborough County, Nova Scotia, closed in 1983. So some amazing history here. And like I said, today we're just touching the surface of this. But like I said, I'm providing a newer perspective just in terms of how this structure, this educational structure, still is impacting students today. So factors such as racism cannot be overlooked as possible barriers to student success in high school or in elementary school, in schooling period. Renowned educator and researcher Dr. George Day from the University of Toronto has conducted extensive research pertaining to systemic racism in schools. He argues that race is physical, social, and cultural. There is an insidious attempt to deracialize students by failing to acknowledge that racistness is a privilege that is only afforded to non-Black students, and that race hierarchies shape and or demarcate our schools, communities, workplaces, social practices, and lived experiences, and that there is a normality to systemic racism that is tempered with utter abhorrence when we are consciously aware of its existence. The milieu of the school environment, as well, can be considered contested public spheres and political sites for the reproduction of power and social inequality. The Ontario Anti-Racism Directorate, or the ARD, works to eliminate systemic racism in government policies, decisions, programs, and advance racial equity in Ontario for Indigenous, Black, and racialized populations. This is a professional advisory that addresses anti-Black racism in education and highlights a recent amendment to the Ontario College of Teachers Act 1996, which now stipulates that making remarks or engaging in behaviors that expose any person or class of persons to hatred on the basis of a prohibited ground of discrimination under Part 1 of the Human Rights Code is an act of professional misconduct. The amendment was designed to put a stop to discrimination both in and out of the classroom. Well, I would definitely like to hear from some Black educators who would like to say whether or not this amendment is being adhered to in the education system. I would like to say that it's not based on what we are still hearing that is happening in schools today. But I digress. Uh, the Ontario College of Teachers, OCT, provides examples that could arguably be indicative of school boards across Canada. The OCT acknowledges that many iterations of anti-Black racism, which may present themselves in the following ways. So, school boards have been known to place students from countries outside of Europe and North America in a lower grade without taking the time to make objective assessment. Excuse me. Hypersurveillance of Black students, including the prevalence of security cameras inside and outside of school property. Educators selecting texts that portray Black people through a deficit lens and reinforce negative stereotypes. Reinforcing the racism of low academic expectations and feedback shared to Black students or career advice given. Introducing predominantly Eurocentric, i.e., white patriarchal teaching materials in all subject areas besides school uniform policies attempting to limit self and cultural expression of Black students through restrictive dress codes, including the banning of hats, do-rags, or coats in classrooms. Lack of opportunities to study or discuss Black contributions and achievement to Canadian history, except for the month of February, which is Black History Month, where efforts may seem performative. Directing Black students to pursue sports without some encouragement to pursue academic courses. Forms of discipline, such as detentions, in ways that are overtly punitive in relation to the offense. So there exists vast intercultural diversity amongst Canadians of the African diaspora, a history that is centuries old that is not possible to share in the confines of this discussion today. It is important to note that according to Statistics Canada, Black people comprise 3.5% of Canada's total population, and about 43% of Black people in Canada are Canadian born. So now I want to discuss the impact, legacy, and pathology of segregation, racism, schooling on students, as well as their well-being and self-esteem and disengagement from the education system. So at this time, and people might be familiar with the story I'm about to share and the person that I'm actually speaking about with this particular story, but I did present this in the book chapter that I wrote. And I thought it was really important to share today because, once again, this is a result of the pedagogical practices, the impression of Black students, the history of colonialism and segregated education. So this is the story of Sally, and I'll go over this relatively quickly. And this is an in-school experience with an anti-Black racism that was shared with me several years ago. I share it here with you today with this individual's permission. So approximately 45 years ago, a young Black girl was in the 4th grade attending elementary school in southwestern Ontario. A white classmate, whom we will call Johnny, called her the N-word. Sally went to her teacher to inform her what had happened. Sally explained, "Ma'am, Johnny called me the N-word." With indifference, the teacher looked at Sally and responded, "Well, you are." Over the years, I've heard Sally retell that story several times. In her presence, I could assess that the wound from that incident was as fresh as if the encounter had happened yesterday. I heard the despair in her voice, and importantly, I saw the disappointment in her eyes. The double impact of the betrayal from her classmates and, more importantly, her teacher, excuse me, whom she had admired and trusted. She endured irrevocable trauma in knowing the teacher validated his racial slur against her, and at that moment, a young girl in the fourth grade felt devalued, demoralized, and dehumanized. That classroom environment was no longer Sally's safe space, trusting and caring space. Fast forward 4 decades, we continue to hear racist slurs and rhetoric and witness violence against children in our K 12 schooling environments. With 2020, with the 2020 declaration that racism is a pandemic, the American Psychological Association, I'll put that information up here, the American Psychological Association, with the assertion came the following decree: we are living in a racism pandemic, which is taking a heavy psychological toll on our African American citizens. The health consequences are dire. Racism is associated with a host of psychological consequences, including depression, anxiety, and other serious, sometimes debilitating conditions, including post traumatic stress disorder and substance use disorders. Moreover, the stress caused by racism can contribute to the development of cardiovascular and physical diseases. The impact of these repeated horrific incidents is inflicting trauma. In Canada, the Canadian Mental Health Commission of Canada also verified the concerns of racism on mental health within the Black community by issuing a resource entitled Shining a Light on Mental Health in Black Communities. And this is from 2021. This resource provides nationwide statistics, the impact of COVID-19, and additional information about the systemic inequities regarding race and mental health care. Additionally, the Canadian Mental Health Association states that over the last 20 years, the Black population in Canada has doubled in size, yet Black individuals face disproportionately high rates of discrimination and racism. As a result, Black people experience alarming and disproportionate rates of psychological distress and mental health symptoms and illnesses. For instance, rates of depression amongst Black individuals were found to be 6 times higher than the general population. The prevalence of the reporting of the occurrences of anti-Black racism in Canadian schools has been highlighted in recent years. For example, in 2020, the Ontario Ministry of Education shared a report of the Peel District School Board revealing insidious anti-Black racism that has plagued their board for decades. Chadna et al. In 2020 also conducted a study which revealed in the report such incidents as the use of the N-word by students without recourse, which made Black students feel like their humanity was devalued, as well as daily microaggressions in the classroom without intervention from the teachers. Additionally, in 2020, Human Rights Tribunal ruled that race was a factor in the 2016 incident, which saw a Black 6-year-old female child, a student, handcuffed at her school by Peel Region police officers by her ankles and wrists and placed on her stomach for 28 minutes. The Ontario Human Rights Tribunal ruled on the incident, stating, "This does not give license to them to treat the applicant in a way that they did. They would not have treated a white 6-year-old child in the same circumstances. Furthermore, Canadian scholar and anti-Black racism researcher and activist Robin Maynard provided insight on the experiences of Black students. For example, in a 2006 census, only 54% of Black youth reported that they felt supported by teachers and reported on such things as their presence was unwanted and they don't care about us. They don't care if we are there or not. This lack of support affects more than academic achievement. Maynard reveals that according to the Ontario Human Rights Commission, these feelings are often in relation to their teachers, that children begin to develop a perception of themselves and of the world around them. Discriminatory treatment at this young age then can enact lasting damage on development. Currently, there's a gap in nationwide data from school boards pertaining to anti-Black racism action plans. It's starting to grow now as we see there's action plans from in this region and with the Greater Essex County District School Board and others as well. Canadian scholarship and reports on the crisis have been extensively conducted by scholars and researchers such as Day, Braithwaite and James and Turner, Chadna, parents of Black children, to name just a few. The scholarship continues to emerge pertaining to systemic practices within the Canadian education system. Yet current information has concentrated primarily in high population dense regions in Ontario, such as the Greater Toronto area. So in terms of the impact of racism on mental health and well-being, reader, in tackling anti-Black racism in healthcare and education speaks to the experiences of African Nova Scotians and Black people pertaining to an initiative led by the academics and public health physicians called the Black Health Education Collaborative. The BHEC affirms that Black health and Black life are intricately connected to the spaces and places in which we live. It is necessary to disrupt the belief that health disparities are biologically based. This simply is not the case. The social determinants of racism, specifically in anti-Black racism, must be taken into consideration. Furthermore, bias, stereotypes, and deficit thinking about Black intellectual capabilities are prevalent within the education system. Researcher Kojo examined Black student achievement in schools and racism and states that there is an endemic devaluation many Black people face in our society and schools. The problem is that they are undervalued. According to Steele, this devaluation grows out of our images of society and the way those images catalog people. The negative stereotypes connected with education and learning begin at the elementary and secondary school levels and continue beyond post-secondary. Negative stereotypes continue and are reinforced through the curriculum and by the school's faculty. Researchers also further assert that the psychological costs are such that the burden of stereotypes depress Black academic performance and impose on Black students self-doubt and aversion to academic competition or completion. So now we talk about the disengagement from the educational system, and I feel this disengagement we've seen this occur maybe over the last 30, 40 years. And I know that I've personally seen it amongst individuals that may have gone through the education systems in the 60s, 70s, and in early 80s. So how the seeds of disengagement are planted into the psyche, how are the seeds of disengagement planted into the psyche of some Black youth? Well, research that emerged decades ago on this matter is ongoing. Dr. Day from the University of Toronto investigated the schooling of Black African Canadian high school students in Ontario and their experience within the education system. His study also incorporated research findings from a school board in Toronto, where research findings showed that among Black students who enrolled in high school in 1987, there was a 42% dropout rate by 1991. The researchers also examined several factors which can lead to the feeling of disengagement from the educational process. Variables such as teacher attitude, lack of parental interest or involvement, family life, peer pressure, racism, and other pressures. Reasons shared for dropping out and disengagement from school included the hidden curriculum, the attitudes and behaviors of teachers and other school personnel, feelings of not belonging, experiencing a lack of encouragement, verbal abuse, ridicule, public humiliation. The reports revealed a desire to learn. However, the students just chose not to deal with these situations on a daily basis. So once again, we talk about whether it's dropout or are the students essentially being pushed out. The Government of Canada commissioned a report which speaks to the mental health issues and impact and pathology of racism titled Social Determinants and Inequities in Healthcare for Black Canadians. The report states, in recent years, racism has been increasingly recognized as an important driver of inequitable health outcomes for racialized Canadians. Black Canadian communities and their allies have long advocated for increased recognition in the specific health and societal impacts of anti Black racism in Canada. This form of discrimination has a long history, uniquely rooted in European colonization in Africa and the legacy of the transatlantic slave trade. Slavery was legal in Canada until 1834. Almost 2 centuries later, racist ideologies established during these periods in history continue to drive processes of stigma and discrimination today. Now, from this slide, there are some stats here. They are from 2016, I believe, but did want to provide you with some information in terms of the graduation rates between different racial identity groups and genders as well in terms of male and female. But so additionally, in 2018, the Government of Canada acknowledged the prevalence and pervasiveness of anti Black racism on members of the Black community. The Promoting Health Equity, Mental Health on Black Canadians Fund supports Black Canadians to develop more culturally focused knowledge, capacity, and programs to improve mental health in their communities. Furthermore, previous to the 2018 report and the fall of 2000, in its 2016 framework for action, the Mental Health Commission of Canada noted that mental well-being is deeply impacted by social determinants of health, such as precarious housing, poverty, social exclusion, and racism. Now, it's important to know that with this, the Promoting Health Equity, Mental Health of Black Canadians Fund, if this is something that anyone is interested, please check the Government of Canada website. I believe this may have been one-time funding, but I urge folks that if this was indeed one-time funding, that this is something that the government needs to earmark because it is not just something that should be available to the population, let's say essentially once in a lifetime. This should be ongoing funding that is provided to and for Canadian citizens doing research in this particular area. So improvements slash empowerment. Well, it's important for us not to impose a deficit mindset on Black people or our Black learners, period. But I know based on how our education system is set up and based on who the majority of our educators are, and just what is being learned and what is being taught, and what we see in the media, this can be extremely difficult and challenging at all times. And as mentioned, the graphics here that I showed include the high school graduation rates based on 2016 data. And as of right now, as a post-secondary education educator, we are trying to collect that information on college and university graduation rates as well. For so long, colleges and universities in Canada have not collected this type of information because I think there was the perceived notion that, oh, it's racist to collect race based information. Meanwhile, our colleagues in the United States have been doing this since time, but this is information that's desperately needed. Identity based information is definitely needed because if you can't measure it, you cannot chart the progress. So this is something I know that we are starting to do at our institution, as well as some post-secondary institutions across the province as well, and across the country. So as I start to wind down, we really need to start thinking about calls to action. You know, one of these things, and many of us, some of us even on this call, I'm sure here today, more Black and racialized teachers are needed. Representation matters, period, full stop. It matters within our education system. And I know this can be extremely challenging because it's a catch-22 situation in terms of, okay, as a Black person, based on how I was treated, why do I want to go into a system such as that? But then to help change the system, we need more people that look like us so we can provide those examples to students so we can help to break those cycles, even though I fully recognize that it's not incumbent upon us to break systemic racism, to break institutional racism. It is the responsibility of all of us, but it should not be solely left to us because we are Black teachers coming into the system, that everything should fall on our shoulders. So I definitely want to be clear about that. But indeed, representation does matter. Teacher education programs need to teach all schools, teach about the history of segregated schools. Is this history being taught? I know when I was a Bachelor of Education student, this particular history was not taught. I don't feel like I fully came to realize some of the history until I was a master's student in education, a graduate student in education. Did I really even know that some of the schools were even in this particular region? So this is essentially outrageous that our teachers, our future teachers, are not getting this history. And if it is being taught, is it sustainable? Do we have people, like, you don't have to be a Black person to care about this history. This is part of your teaching history. This is part of your teaching praxis. You should know this information as an educator going into the education system. And school boards themselves need to make sustainable changes. We are not here, any of us, we are not here for the performative. We are not here just to be talked about during Black History Month. We are not here just because, oh, somebody's watching interest convergence in order to make these changes. And then, okay, when the heat is off, okay, we can go back to our old ways of doing things. No, we want concrete, sustainable changes that are going to change the system and really be about an educational system that. Oh, sorry, I think.
I can hear you now. Yep.
Okay, yeah, my headphones were connected to my phone, and of course somebody was calling me, so I apologize for that. So yeah, just making sure that our school boards are making those sustainable changes, and our communities holding our school boards accountable as well. I say, definitely don't call us resilient. I personally take issue with that particular phrase, especially when it comes to racism and especially through the educational system, because we shouldn't have to be resilient. We shouldn't have to endure the indignities of racism in order to earn an education on a daily basis. So, no, we shouldn't have to be resilient. We should just be ourselves going about our daily practice in school as a student, as an educator, as a teacher. okay? We shouldn't have to be resilient. And empowerment through self-determination. So many of the students I see out here these days, I almost see them with a sense of pride because they almost are, to many respects, are writing their own future. More and more are going on to post-secondary education, even though there's various forms of post-secondary education, and there still needs to be that sort of encouragement that they can do it. I notice in my practice that there's still a little bit of a sense of hesitation in terms of whether they feel like they can or not. So, it takes a community to get behind these students, our own kids, our nieces, our nephews, to build that level of confidence, to let them know that they can, because I believe this has just been part of, once again, representation in all areas, but also that feeling of not knowing and maybe not seeing, but sometimes, to go to maybe a trite expression, seeing is believing. And so that can instill empowerment in many of our youth as well. So here I wanted to provide, and this is not an exhaustive list of my resources. I would probably have at least 6 pages for you. But if you are interested in the book that is hot off the presses that I mentioned earlier in the presentation today, I have a listing of all of those resources that were used in that book chapter, which speaks to many of the things that I presented today. So I definitely encourage you to go out and get that book, read chapter number 3. Let me know what you think, and I'm so happy that this chapter will be shared with future teachers as well. And I'm hoping that some in-service teachers will be reviewing that information as well. But this is just a little snapshot of some of the resources that I use today, and that is used in the research I've been conducting in that book chapter, as well as additional research that I'm doing as well. So I want to leave you all today with some information about myself. If you need to reach me, that's the information in terms of my day job. You can reach me at Marium at uwindsor.ca. I'm the Director of Anti-Racism Organizational Change at the University of Windsor. And I would be remiss if I didn't say that as president of the Our Day Study Club, we are celebrating our 90th anniversary. So on November 9th, if you would like to join us, please, our special guest is Michael Jean, and tickets are available on our website. So we hope to see you there. But thank you all so much for allowing me this opportunity to speak with you today. Like I said, this is just a snapshot in terms of the lasting impact of segregated schools on Black Canadians, on, excuse me, on many of the individuals that we know, our aunts, uncles, great aunts, grandparents, great grandparents, and really how we see that carry over into the educational system today. And definitely there's more information to come based on this study and this research. So once again, thank you everyone. And that's it for me for today, Lorraine.
Thank you so much, Miriam. That was fantastic. And I wanted to open it up to the audience now if they had any questions, comments, or if you are connected, know somebody who is spoken about today that you wanted to share some information. I'll start off with one comment we did get in the comment section already, and it is quite helpful information. So I've copied it and I will email that to you, Miriam, so you have it.
Okay.
It's from Kenneth Scott. He says, for your files, the Partridge River School at East Preston, Nova Scotia, the Henry G. Bald School located at the original grounds of the Nova Scotia Home for Colored Children, as well as the primary school number 17, aka Queen Street School in the south end of St. John, New Brunswick, are other less talked about segregated schools worthy of further discussion and research. And again, I've copied this and I'll email that to you. They've also included a file name as well, which I will email that to you as well. And we do also have someone just typing in a comment right now. So I'll just wait for them to finish. But again, I'll email you the all the information to you after the presentation.
Oh, perfect, perfect.
And oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, and I really appreciate that information because, like I said, this is just really a snapshot, and I know that there are people within our community that have so much more information that they can share. So I am so grateful for that. So, and this is why I thank you and the museum for having these conversations because it just allows us to get together and share this information. So, thank you.
Yeah, this is such incredibly important information to share. So I am so grateful to you. So thank you. And we do have another comment question. It says, "This is really wonderful. Thank you." It's from Patrick. He says, "I'm a research assistant with the English project at Western University about experiences of Black Londoners in the 1800s," which, if for anyone interested, they did do a presentation for the Black History series a few months ago, if you wanted to watch that on our YouTube page. But their question is, this is a fairly specific question, but do you know of any segregated schools from London?
Oh, not that not that I came across in my research. Um, I I would actually, and I hate to assume, but I would have to assume that some existed there. So you're putting me on a mission right now because just based on the demographic and the history of London, I can see that being the case. So yeah, like I'm actually going to explore that. I didn't come across any specifically for today's presentation and as part of the research that I've done up until now, but um, I will be investigating for sure.
Perfect. Okay, and if anyone has any other questions as well, you don't have to type in your question. You can raise your hand and answer or ask your question as well. Um, but if not, it looks like those are the questions we have for today in the comments. And again, I'll email you the
Oh,
information I found.
I think
Oh, we have,
there's
sorry. Oh,
one.
perfect. Oh, Professor Shaw. Yes, go ahead. Thank you.
Sorry about that. Let me just take off my camera. Sorry, I'm in the middle of cooking as well. It's nice to see you again.
Oh, hey, yeah.
I'm glad you're feeling better, and thank you so much for your wonderful presentation. I was thinking about what you said about, the practices of performance. We're not here to perform, and what your research has shown you about different perspectives and different agendas towards change and reform. So, you know, the reasons and impetuses for wanting to change something, you can work collaboratively with people, but they may have different reasons for wanting to work. So how has your research, if at all, demonstrated that you could work together with people even though they may have different reasons for wanting to do a similar type of initiative?
Thank you, Dr. Shaw. I appreciate it, and it's good to see you again. That's a great question because it's interesting when you're engaging in this type of work, you always have to sort of wonder what are the motivating forces for each and every single person. Is it because out of a sense of, altruism or benevolence, or okay, I want to be a better educator, so let's do this, or out of a sense of accountability, right? So it's really interesting to look at the various perspectives in terms of what brings people to the table to attempt to make the change. And I say that purposely because of the fact that we may be making these efforts to attempt to make these changes, but are we looking at sustainable change? And that's where we fall short time and time and time and time and time again, because sometimes changing can be based on leadership at the time. It can be based on funding, or just people, maybe those people that were at the table for whatever reason, they go to another institution, they retire, and so on and so forth. So, what is it that can be done to embed those changes as part of everyday practices? So that's the key. So whether or not people are coming based on, their own self in terms of, okay, I want to make the change, I want to be a change maker, or because it's out of a sense of accountability, or because eyes are watching, that's fine and dandy. But as long as those changes become embedded into a new way of doing things that will be lasting, that will go on from one year to the next will outlive budget programming, will outlive whoever's, at the top in terms of leadership. So that's the important aspect of it, that it really has to come more from a position of, okay, we have to dot our I's and cross our T's and treat it as a EDI initiative. And once again, that's where we fall flat, right? Because it's more of, okay, well, we have to do this EDI thing. Well, no, it's we have to make the changes that are going to be part of the everyday process. And sometimes, I've even in a lot of the group work and collaborations, I've really had to turn around and ask people, okay, what is your motivation for being here? Because I mean, you have to be straight up and be honest, because if it is out of a sense of, okay, well, my boss told me I had to be here or whatever the case might be, you might as well just start from scratch again, because it's not going to work. And sometimes being honest with that, okay, it might set you back, but the thing is, I rather there be a setback rather than trying to rush to trying to do something that's just going to fall flat in a matter of 6 months to a year's time. So, but I hope that in some way that's answered your question.
Very much did, because what you were saying about, community based and how we have our nieces or nephews, I think sometimes there's different types of motivations. And when you know that you want the people that you love and you care about, and you're very much connected to their well being, it doesn't become an EDI initiative, it becomes a survival of your loved ones and kin. And so it becomes a different type of question and context for people of African descent, because, the harm that's being done to our children and the people that we love it's not sustainable for us. Whereas if it's just like, an administrative kind of, popular thing, it can become something that you just check off in a box. So I'm really glad that you are doing this work and the way that you're
Thank
doing it.
you.
Yeah,
Thank you. I appreciate that.
pleasure. Take care.
Take care.
Thank you so much. Okay, so I'm gonna just check the chat just to see if there's anything else. Okay, and just another comment, just thanking you again for a great presentation. And I don't see any other hands raised, so I think we'll end it there. But again, Marium, I just wanted to say thank you again so much. I know you're under the weather, so I just really did do appreciate that. Oh, actually, we are getting, I apologize. There is
Oh, that's okay.
another uh, question. So Ms. Thompson, you can go ahead. Marguerite?
Yes, good morning. And
Good
thank you.
morning.
This is important because it's ongoing through several generations. And this year, I have a 4-year-old grandson starting school. And it's interesting to see what has impacted me from when you pointed out about education. And I went to school in Toronto, so not one of the segregated schools, but I've met people that have shared about their experiences having attended one down here specifically going to Harrow. And so the things that we bring as educators into the forum, it's important that there's some change done over time, because the experiences that I have that impacted me even to this point in with my age, I don't want that to hinder my grandson starting out on this venture in September with his
Hmm.
education. And so it is important for us to realize that, and to have these forums where we can uh, um, glean from all of your research, my goodness, and the connectivity of it even in other provinces. I didn't realize it was so rampant throughout, and here we're still hearing about New Brunswick and other places as well.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
it is important. So thank you for even the eye opener and inviting us to be a part of this morning, and for your time and effort for this comprehensive um, um, array of research that you've done, and then your presentation, and for the chapter 3. Thank you for inviting us, Mariam.
Thank you so much, Margaret. And I'm just, really honored that I had the opportunity to present that book chapter. And it almost didn't even happen because at the time when I was trying to finalize and submit, a final version of it. There were just a lot of things going on in my life, and some close family members had passed away, and I just gave up. And Dr. Lindsay Jaber, who was a professor of mine and who's also the editor of the book, was just really encouraging me, and just knowing this chapter was just so important, and this perspective, because nobody else was writing about it. I'm like, okay, if it's not going to be me who's going to provide that connection in terms of the legacy, the pathology of racism, and how it started, and especially knowing that this information is going to be shared with Bachelor of Education students, I'm just like, okay, if I'm not going to do it, then who's going to do it? I mean, this is just too important to sit on, and it kind of helped me through writing about it. Kind of helped me through my grief at the time. It was therapeutic in many ways, because I could see what was ahead. I could see that we keep talking about, okay, future educators need to know this information. They need to be equipped with something. We can no longer accept that, oh, I didn't know. Well, how could you be an educator and not know? So just those thoughts and trying to provide that connection is really what drove me to keep writing and putting forth the information. And even though it's a chapter within a book, it's definitely a book on its own, because even with today's presentation, like I mentioned earlier, we're just scratching the surface, right? And it's just one perspective in terms of someone who's doing doctoral research from the social, cultural, and political aspect, right? So, but thank you for your comment, Margaret. It means a lot.
Okay, so I don't see any other comment, or there is another comment just saying thank you so much. That was very well presented. No one else that has their hands raised, so I think now we will end things here. So you can go get some rest. And again, thank you so much for that fantastic presentation, and thank you to our audience as well for being here and for the great discussion. Again, this is recorded and it will be uploaded to our YouTube page, and you can find it on our Facebook page as well, so that you can rewatch. Which I definitely want to, because there's so much information you shared today. It's just such an important topic you're sharing with us today. So thank you again, and thank you all for being here today.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Take care.
Thanks. Take care.
Bye.
Bye.